Good evening. I'm Ryan Patrick Irvin, artistic producer at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. Welcome to tonight's program, a conversation with Lucy Antek Johnson on her new edition of Samuel Antek's This Was Toscanini, The Maestro, My Father, and Me. Already considered one of the most insightful looks at the career of the conductor Arturo Toscanini, Johnson expands upon her father's memoirs with her own recollections and reflections. Tonight, she and music historian Harvey Sachs, author of the definitive biography of Toscanini, will discuss the conductor's legacy, the origins of the NBC Symphony Orchestra, and Samuel Antek's own career as a musician and conductor. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the program.
I remember first reading This Was Toscanini in 1963 when it first came out. I was 17 years old, and I got hold of it right away because I was already a big Toscanini admirer. And I remember being absolutely fascinated by the book because I had read, biographies of him, those that existed up to that time. But this was really a dramatic first-hand account of what it was like to work with Arturo Toscanini. And, I imagined who the author was and his position in the orchestra and so on and so forth. But now we have a new version of the book, which until now has been out of print for many years. And we have the author's daughter, Lucy Antek Johnson.
The author's daughter, yes. I was about the same age when the book came out. He had died very suddenly at age 49 in 1958. And it was a question of how the book would get finished. And we can talk about that later. But at that time, which was just a few years after Toscanini had died as well in 1963, Toscanini was still, I would say, a rock star. I mean, he was still one of the most famous men in the world and most revered musicians. And so there was a hunger, I gather, a hunger for what was he really like, that behind the scenes feeling. And I believe my father captured that in his memoir, which is what it is. It's a memoir of his 17 years as a first violinist with the NBC Symphony under the legendary baton of Toscanini. And it's not a biography. You're the biography master. But it's an intimate portrait, both of the man and the music making. And it really takes you through creative process. And there are a lot of great artistic geniuses through the centuries. And that phrase is not used lightly with Toscanini. He was called an artistic genius even when he was alive. And the audience usually just sees the results, a concert or a recording. And here you're brought into the orchestra almost as though you're sitting in the orchestra with the players, experiencing firsthand what they experienced during these rehearsals and concerts and tours and recording sessions. So it's very firsthand. And there have been a lot of books written and interviews, and I'm not talking about biographies, but anecdotal information. But this is was then and might still be the only full-length narrative about that experience and about that process. And I've learned to think that it's like being invited into a master class with an artistic genius, and that you're privileged to see the ups and downs and the moods and the conducting style and the music making process and the frustrations and the joys and all that went with it in this book, the original, and now this reprint of This Was Toscanini. my father, I found a letter, actually in the New York Library here, that he wrote to his publisher, where he said, I will describe, when he had first gotten the commission for the book, I will describe what I have actually seen, felt, and heard Toscanini say, what was asked of us, those who made music with him. So I know that my father stayed as true as he could to, without embellishing an opinion, too much editorialization. My father had a very conversational style, and it's very accessible. And, but it's a memoir. It's told in the first person. When I decided to reissue it, and I will tell that Harvey was a great part of that decision, I thought at first, oh, I'll just do an introduction, and then we'll have this wonderful text. Well, I got so involved in the research, both of the photographs and the letters that I had at home and that which I found here at the library, at his archives, which I had donated about 15 or 20 years ago, that I said, there's so much more to say here, and that my father deserves a bit of a spotlight. And in my introductions to each of his original chapters, so that's the maestro, my father, and me, I'm the me, I'm going to tell his story as it relates to the NBC Symphony and Toscanini's influence on our lives. But also, he was an accomplished, not just virtuoso violinist, but he became a very accomplished and recognized conductor. And so I weave in and out as I lead the reader into his chapter, a little bit more about our family and a little bit more about his career and my memories. So I like to say it's a memoir wrapped in a memoir. But the focus is on the stars, Toscanini and my dad, and I'm the me.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to one of the things that you mentioned. People often ask me, you know, what do you think of this conductor, that conductor, perhaps a young conductor, or the new conductor of this orchestra or that orchestra? And I very often say, I don't know, because I've only seen him or her in concert. I haven't yet been at a rehearsal. Rehearsal is where 90% of the conductor's work takes place. And until you observe how the conductor works with the orchestra, what the command of the score is, you really don't know. Toscanini was always trying to figure out what it was that the composer wanted, knowing that he would never arrive at exactly what the composer wanted, because it's not possible to do that.
What over and over is reinforced for me and in the book is it was always the goal to make the music better and better and better. And people might think or have a memory that he was maybe had some egomaniacal things. He had a proper ego, clearly. He was famous and accomplished, but he wasn't using that. He was reaching for, how do I make this better? How do I make this better? And it must have been quite a startling for those musicians when they first were assembled for this new orchestra in 1937. I'd like to just say, though, first, because I have to give you some credit here. In 2017, when your book, Toscanini, A Musician of Conscience, first came out, which, by the way, is a fabulous read, I saw that quotes from my dad's book had been utilized within it. And I was so proud. I was so thrilled because it had been out of print. And then to top that, in the New Yorker review of your book, and also celebrating Toscanini's 150th birthday, David Denby, who had written the article, also used those same quotes. And I thought, oh my God, I have to take this seriously. These quotes have lasted. His words still, my father's words still had value. And I went back and reread the book, which I hadn't read for a few decades, and I was entranced of how accessible it was and all the things we've been talking about. And that's what inspired me, and then you and I met and talked. Absolutely, I knew it was time to reissue it. It's timeless. Great art is timeless.
Yes.
And even though his fame might have been a little different in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s than it might be today, or familiarity, what he accomplished and what his contribution was that is so everlasting, and his artistry is absolutely timeless. And that's what really encouraged me to move forward with this endeavor.
Yeah.
And then when I added essays, I'll call them, or introductions about my father's own career, but always in the service of how we were all influenced, even in our family. I was not even born when the NBC Symphony was created, but I grew up with an autographed picture on the piano in our Upper West Side apartment, and it was our beacon. He did influence us. Many meal times were spent talking about him, whether it was about a rehearsal or a concert. And today, that same picture sits on the same piano in my Connecticut living room. It's still, to me, it's a beautiful picture, but it's also about a beacon of excellence and what to strive for. I, too, am real curious to hear your take, because my father was only 29 when he joined and was invited to join, and he had been a soloist up until then, and we can talk about that later. But I would like to know more, because you really know the origins of the symphony and how these musicians were chosen.
Right. Well, actually, it's interesting because the NBC Symphony came into existence by accident in a way. I mean, Toscanini had retired from the New York Philharmonic. He had been principal conductor of the New York Philharmonic. He retired in the spring of '36 when he was 69 years old, which at that time was, sort of beyond the average life expectancy already. He considered himself an old man. And the following year, or maybe it was later that year, David Sarnoff, who was chairman of the board of RCA, which was the parent organization of NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, he had the idea of inviting Toscanini to come back to make some recordings again with the Philharmonic and perhaps take it on a tour. And Toscanini politely said no. He didn't feel like doing it at that point. And at that moment, Sarnoff had the idea, why don't we actually create a radio orchestra for Toscanini? And don't forget, the Philharmonic, being, having a series of subscription concerts and so on, had perhaps 4 or 5 rehearsals a week and 4 performances a week, and Toscanini felt that was too much for him at that point. And so Sarnoff's proposal was for a radio orchestra that would do whatever number of rehearsals were required, Toscanini required, and only 1 performance a week. And on top of that, they offered him $4,000 per concert, which was an unbelievable amount of money at that time. I mean, no other musician, however famous, was paid that much. And Toscanini agreed to try it. He accepted to come for a season and to do 10 concerts, and then he would see at that point.
Now was the day that the maestro was going to come into this rehearsal, and it was going to be the first rehearsal, I'm going to read from the book now, from their premiere performance under the baton of one of the most famous men in the world. They were about to make musical history, but now I'm going to use my father's words to tell you about it. The orchestra sat in rapt and tingling silence on the huge stage of Studio 8H, awaiting the first appearance of our conductor. There was no audience. The men, instruments in hand, sat nervously rigid, scarcely breathing. Suddenly, from a door on the right side of the stage, a small, solidly built man emerged, immediately discernible with the crowning white hair and the impassive, square, high-cheekboned, bemustached face. In his hand, he carried a baton. As he stepped up to the podium, we all rose like puppets suddenly propelled to life by the pent-up tension. We had been warned in advance not to make any vocal demonstration, and we stood silent, eagerly and anxiously staring. He looked around, apparently bewildered by our unexpected action, and gestured a faint greeting with both arms, a mechanical smile lighting his pale face for an instant. Somewhat embarrassed, we sat down again. Then in a rough, hoarse voice, he called out, "Brahms!" He looked at us piercingly for the briefest moment, then raised his arms. In one smashing stroke, the baton came down. A vibrant sound suddenly gushed forth from the tense players. With each heart-pounding timpani stroke in the opening bars of Brahms' First Symphony, his baton became more powerful, more insistent, his shoulders strained and hunched as though buffeting a giant wind. His outstretched left arm spasmodically flailed the air, his cupped fingers pleading like a beseeching beggar. His face reddened, muscles tightened, eyes and eyebrows constantly moving, and we in the violin section tore with our bows against our strings. I felt I was being sucked into a roaring maelstrom of sound. I sensed, more than I heard, with near disbelief, the new sounds around me. Was this the same music we had been practicing so assiduously for days? With what fierce new joy we played. So, he bellowed, cantare, sostenere, sing, sustain, Toscanini's battle cry. I was to hear these words often in the years to come. This was the first time they were flung at us, and for 17 years we lived by them. Caught up in his force, you were not just a player, another musician, but an artist. You were curiously alive, and there was purpose and self-fulfillment in your work. It was not just a job, but a calling. Toscanini often said, any asino can conduct, but to make music is difficile. You can
Beautiful.
figure out the translation.
Beautiful, beautiful.
So
Yes.
that was the first rehearsal for that debut concert. They got through it, they did very well. And the opening night concert, of which there's the Silk program, but I also read there were, I think, 1,400 available seats and 23,000 requests for tickets. Now, that's rock star status,
Right.
especially in New York. He was so popular because of the Philharmonic, and
Yes.
I'm sure. But he filled arenas around the world. I mean, he was
Yeah.
so big around the world. George Zell, Cleveland Symphony, who has been known to say that Arturo Toscanini was a truth teller, that there was before Toscanini and after Toscanini. And Riccardo Muti has quoted, part of his quote is, Toscanini was a revolutionary of musical interpretation. What made him so unique? What set him apart?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. He certainly wasn't the only conductor or, instrumentalist, singer whose ideal was to express what it was that the composer had in mind when the notes were set down on paper. But he had the desire, the will, and the talent to realize that goal probably better than, certainly than most, and perhaps than almost anybody else. What we will talk about some of the violent outbursts that occurred occasionally in his rehearsals. But, you know, some of that was, I would say almost all of it was, I have to do this in order to achieve this goal of whatever my idea at this moment happens to be of this particular piece, of getting it right. And somehow or other, we're not there. And
He would like hear the perfection in his head.
I remember Robert Bloom told me, he was the principal oboe of the NBC Symphony for its first, I think, 6 years. And he said he once had to go to Toscanini's home to talk to him about some personnel problem in the orchestra or something like that. And he went there in the morning and he saw Toscanini looking very tired. And he said, "Maestro, you look so tired. What's something wrong?" And he said, "I was up all night studying the program for this week." Well, what was the program? The main piece was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which he had conducted many times. And Bloom said to him, "Maestro, you've done this so many times." And Toscanini said, "But I'm always afraid that I've missed something." Well, this is a serious artist. You know?
And I definitely want to talk about the outbursts because they're so known, but they also, in a sense, served a purpose. My father writes that Toscanini had attained a pinnacle of honor and success matched by few persons of any age, but despite this, he seemed an unhappy man. We always sensed his frustration in reaching for something just beyond his grasp. We sensed his despair and his uncertainty, and we loved him for it. But he had said to my dad on that visit, and I'm quoting him talking to my father, "I am never happy with myself, never. I am always so nervous when I have to step before the orchestra. Even after all these years, it's as though it's the first time I conduct." That's very moving.
Yeah.
That he's not only aware of, but sharing his, let's call it
Yes.
insecurities, I don't know.
Yeah, and he said that many times. And, you know, there was a famous scene in the memoirs of Gregor Piatigorsky, famous cellist, who performed a solo concerto with Toscanini in the New York Philharmonic. And he mentions in his memoirs that just before they were supposed to go on stage, Toscanini was pacing back and forth, pacing. And he at some point says, "We're not much good, you and I," he says to Piatigorsky. And Piatigorsky in his memoir wrote, "I wished I had died as a baby." He said, "Maestro, you're making me so nervous. I'm already so nervous. Please stop." And Toscanini's pacing back and forth and back and forth. And just as they're about to go on, Toscanini turns to him and says, "But the others are worse." So that was his, you know, the best he could say.
Right.
I'm not very good, but
Well,
I'm better than the others.
I'm still better than the other guy. His offstage demeanor, he was actually, as written and as I understand it, very congenial and enjoyed conversation. It usually always turned to music. It wasn't about grandchildren, it would be music. He was available for any of his players to come up and talk to him, and always in the breaks or after rehearsal, he was very accessible. But in rehearsal, he could be a bit tyrannical. And in the service of what we've been talking about, because he also had a photographic memory, which is a tool. He didn't develop, he didn't work at it, but it was a gift. And yet he would always say to the players, look to the score, play what is written, don't memorize, please don't memorize. And when he would feel that things were not either going his way or the way that he had hoped it would go, he would get a little crazed.
Right.
So my father writes about a few of these outburst flare-ups, he calls them, that petrified the guys. But one of them, Harvey's going to now do the honors.
Yeah, your father writes One of his most violent displays of temper concerned nothing more than 2 grace notes that had not been articulated in Wagner's Tannhäuser overture, a momentous crime in Toscanini's eyes. The small notes, he would shout. These seeming minutiae were terribly important to him, and they became so to us, because to Toscanini, music was no game of wits or cerebral discourse, no mere titillation of the ear, no mere gratification of the senses, no intellectual ash heap for musicologists and academicians. It was dramatically personal and elemental. It was also sheer physical struggle as he roared his defiance at the devils that were preventing his pianissimo from coming into being, his rubato from falling into place, his tempo from pulsing forth. Every movement of his baton, every motion of his hands, every burst of rage served music. I have seen him rip his jacket to shreds in exasperation because he felt the orchestra was holding back in its attention and zeal. Dramatic, stagey, theatrical, yes, but always so wonderfully honest, sincere, and so extraordinarily effective in creating the mood and feeling within us that he sought.
And often my father would say that the musicians, they struggled, but they loved him for it in the end because they understood that they were all going to the same place to make the best piece of music, most beautiful music you can. For 40 years and more, I have heard words of admiration, of wonder, but I am, and I will always be that unhappy man, always unsure of himself, fearful and anxious about the choice of a movement or an expression. Poor devil, poor Artaud.
So Toscanini's conducting style was very direct, not showy at all, and I would say the most salient aspect of it was the eye contact that he had with the musicians. And in fact, many musicians who played with him, who I talked to over the years, said the same thing. I always felt he was looking at me, which of course was impossible. It can't have happened. But this look that he had that really controlled what was going on in the orchestra. I would turn to, as an example, his conducting of the Nuages, Clouds, the first movement of Debussy's 3 nocturnes for orchestra. This performance took place very late in Toscanini's career. He was almost 85, I believe. And if you watch how he cues and controls the dynamic level and everything else basically with his eyes, he conducts, the baton movement is minimal, and when he has to subdivide the beat, it's like this. It's not, big, choppy gestures. He never disturbs the flow of the music. And as another example, I would show sort of the opposite of this amazing drive that he communicated to the orchestra. I would turn to the finale of the Brahms First Symphony. Again, this was a performance that took place when he was in his mid-80s. And you can see the sweat pouring from his face as he conducts this. This ability to really stir the orchestra into a tremendous fury of action in a piece that requires it. So you've got these 2 opposite approaches.
In the foreword, you were so generous to write the foreword to this new edition of my book. And you talk more about his early life and how he started off as a cellist, and how young he was when he got his first opportunity to conduct. And it's an interesting story. because from then on he never looked back from that.
Right. Yes, he had been, after having graduated from the Conservatory in Parma, Italy, his hometown, he was engaged as principal cello and assistant chorus master of a touring Italian opera company that was going to South America. And while they were on the tour, the conductor, who was a Brazilian, and this was in Rio de Janeiro, the conductor quit suddenly. And so Toscanini, first their assistant conductor started to try to conduct, and the audience created a fuss, and then somebody asked Toscanini to conduct because they knew that he knew all the operas by heart. He had rehearsed
whole
the
repertoire.
singers. He knew the whole repertoire by heart, basically. And at first he didn't want to do it, but then he accepted to do it. And he conducted Aida by heart at the age of 19, and then took over the rest of the tour. There were 11 or 12 operas.
He was, no question, a national treasure in Italy and known throughout the world for his music. But when the fascist regime came in, that dramatically changed everything. And he was a staunch anti-fascist. He was and a humanitarian, and whatever his earlier beliefs, once Mussolini came in and once Hitler came into power, he pulled back and he refused to play where Hitler was in power, and then he got attacked. Maybe you could just tell what changed his attitude toward playing in Italy.
Well, he was conductor of La Scala from 1921 to 29. That was his sort of third time as music director there. And that was a golden age for La Scala. Some of their greatest productions took place at that time. Among other things, he conducted the world premiere of Turandot, of Puccini. But Mussolini came to power in 1922, and by 25, Italy had become pretty much a dictatorship. And Toscanini was very outspoken against the fascist regime. And Mussolini, started his life his career as a journalist. So he was very loath to touch Toscanini because it would be bad publicity for the regime. I think if Toscanini had done what he did in Nazi Germany, they would have had him killed. But he went on saying what he believed and conducting occasionally in Italy after he had gone to New York to conduct the Philharmonic. He was supposed to conduct a couple of concerts in the city of Bologna in 1931, and he refused to conduct the fascist party anthem before
It's
the performance,
Giovinezza.
Giovinezza, Youth. And he was going toward the theater where the performance was to take place. He was attacked by a bunch of young fascists and slapped and knocked to the ground.
Because he had defied Il Duce.
Yes, because they said, are you going to conduct it? No, he said, I'm not, and they attacked him. And after that, he didn't conduct again in Italy.
The different chapters in the book, as you know, are not all about rehearsals and concerts and conducting style, although that's a very meaty part of the book and a very important part of witnessing the creative process. But there are really some wonderful other chapters which show other parts of Toscanini's personality and my father's involvement. One of them is the touring with Toscanini. Now, my father's chapter was about their 1950 cross-country tour, which was a huge triumph. They had a private train and they were treated like royalty, and Toscanini was particularly relaxed and the men were relaxed and they could really spend time with him and enjoy each other's company. What I discovered that my father hadn't written about, which I just don't know why, was their 1940 South American tour, which was partly in partnership with the State Department to work on relationships with Latin America. But listen, it was probably also RCA thinking, oh, we could get more record buyers
Absolutely.
or listeners or something. That's
Absolutely.
perfectly legitimate. And they took a ship, left, I think, like June 1st, 1940. And both my parents, my mother they were married at this point. This was their first real honeymoon, even though they'd been married. They got married a year before. But in 1940, they embarked, as did the whole orchestra, with many of the spouses, called orchestra wives, on this ship to South America to give another tour. And it just so happened that I found my mother's journal in her handwriting that she had kept day by day, that I mean, I must have seen this when I went through these boxes 10 years ago. It's as though I never saw it. And she really brought this to life for me and for hopefully the reader, about what it was like to be on that ship with the maestro and the musicians, and now it's wartime, because war had broken out in Europe. It hadn't yet gotten to America, but it was still scary because they were going into Nazi kind of Nazi territory. So she writes on the 10th day, terrible news, Italy is in the war. I'm scared, what'll it mean? When AT, because she refers to him as AT, received the news at lunch, he ran out of the dining room up to his room. It's depressing, there's a heavy cloud over everything. Rehearsal was called for 10:15, but when the men came down, they were told it was called off. He couldn't make it. He was so depressed over the world news, he couldn't understand how people could kill one another. And he walks around with a crucifix in his pocket, fingering it all the time for the Allies. And he stayed in his cabin for 2 days. And she was really frightened. And the captain and the leaders of the orchestra kept giving them speeches, don't talk to anyone, assume everyone is the enemy. So it was very nerve-wracking. And yet, when they got to each of these cities, Montevideo, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, they were welcomed, even though there was heckling in the audience. Sometimes it was pretty ugly. They were just, I think it was Montevideo, there was a 15-minute ovation at the end of this. So all in all, even when they came back to the States 6 weeks later and they were really pleased to see that New York harbor, it was a triumph. It was a triumph, and very trying for some of them, but a triumph. But there they were yet again, steeped in the politics, and how sad he was when Italy had declared war on the Allies. But the tour in America is also a wonderful story. And by then, my father was a conductor. Now I'll give a little background. He was trained as a violinist. He was brought up in Chicago. He was a very young age, was recognized as a prodigy. His parents were not quite sure what that meant, but they listened and they tried to get him the best teachers in Chicago. And pretty much in his mid to late teens, he moved to New York and studied with Leopold Auer, and then got a fellowship to Juilliard and started concertizing, and gave his debut at Town Hall in 1936, and that was very well received. And that might have been one of the kickoffs of how people at the NBC Symphony were aware of him. That's the missing piece that I'm so curious about. But he had always wanted to conduct. And that almost sounds like a cliche, like everyone in Hollywood always wants to, but he wants to be a director. But he really did, and he'd been conducting small ensembles all through this period and in the beginning of the NBC Symphony. And he was hired once as a soloist for the General Foods Radio Hour, as a violin soloist. And they were live broadcasts. And just like the Toscanini story, or again from a Hollywood movie, the conductor got sick. And they knew my dad had conducting experience. And they said, would you do the broadcast tonight? And he said, okay. And not only did that turn out well, but he did the rest of their seasons as the conductor. And he got much more secure and much more confident in his hopes and dreams. And he said, I really want to conduct a major orchestra. And it would seem very much so that Toscanini encouraged it and supported it. He was named, my father was named a musical director and conductor of the New Jersey Symphony in 1947, and he held both positions. He never gave up his seat with the NBC Symphony, and I think only missed maybe one recording session in all those years, which was quite amazing, but he worked it out. But what he did, and he kind of turned the New Jersey Symphony around, giving a little more star power and hiring some bigger names to be soloists and guests. But the crowning achievement for me, because I was old enough at that age to go to the concerts, were his children's concerts. And he had inaugurated his children's concerts a few years before Leonard Bernstein, where there was a lot of audience interaction and talk about tempo and talk about composers, and he made it a very involving thing for these young audiences, playing, John Philip Sousa or Prokofiev,
Peter and the Wolf.
Peter and the Wolf, or things that the kids would respond to. But he also made it an interactive experience. And I would stand, very often I would sit in the audience, but I would stand in the wings, absolutely like beaming with "That's My Daddy" pride. And then when he'd come off stage, he would be surrounded by the kids, and they'd all want his autograph. And but I knew I was the one lucky enough to go home with him at night. So I was very proud of him. And I was very young, and I don't know if that age you know that you're proud of somebody, but I knew our life was different than other kids. And as he became more known and became engaged with other major orchestras around the country, and then became the official director of all children's concerts for Ormandy in Philadelphia, and became the assistant conductor in Chicago, which was his hometown, with Reiner, he was turning into quite a personality on his own and had fame on his own. And he was very handsome and very well-spoken. So the combination of his continued work with Toscanini and his new rise in the world of conducting and recognition, and held good recognition. He was commissioned for by Saturday Review, a magazine at the time, to write an article about playing with the maestro. What was it like? Because everyone always wanted to know, what is he really like? And he wrote it, and eventually Toscanini had read it and complimented him on it. But it was that article, which came out on the eve of the 1950 tour, where a publisher came to him and said, let's expand this. Can you expand this into a book? So from that, and he said yes. And from that point on, he was writing and writing and writing on his spare moments, and which were few because he was traveling a lot. But that tour, both the 1940 tour and the 1950 tour, was very much part of his own arc as a musician. And when Toscanini, I think it was 1952, asked my dad to guest conduct the NBC Symphony, well, my goodness.
Can't get much better.
His future was sealed. And so, people would say, well, what's it like at home? Is it different? Well, yeah, it was different. The phone was ringing off the hook, but it was nice. It was fun. My friends' dads went to offices during the day and were home at night, and mine was rehearsing during the day in the living room and went to the concert hall at night. But there are significant memories, and one of them is we had a living room where there were double doors and the piano was, and I'd hear him playing chords and make a note, quiet, there'd be a notation. He'd play some more chords, there'd be a notation. I said, what is he playing? I was probably 8. What is he playing? And so I knocked and he invited me to sit down next to him, and I saw that he was working out a score for one of his New Jersey concerts. And I had never seen this, these pages and pages of all the
parts
the parts
stacked
and
up.
the chorus stacked up, and how you read vertically and horizontally, and how he heard it all in his head. And that was eye-opening to me, and that was my first exposure to that. And someone had once asked me, what do I think was something that he learned from Toscanini? Now, you'd have to ask him. I can't put that thought, and he doesn't directly address it. But I would say it was how to read it. I mean, he had his own style, and he had his own way of dealing with musicians. He certainly had learned what not to do, but of probably how to read a score, how to interpret a score. And in that chapter, The Visit, which is also another interesting chapter, where he had a very unusual experience where he was invited to Riverdale, Villa Pauline, for 2 hours because he wanted to get some advice on, he was about to conduct Verdi's Requiem with the New Jersey Symphony, and he was seeking the advice from the maestro. And almost instead of even talking about the Requiem, the maestro just talked wonderfully for 2 hours about Verdi, about composers. He was pulling out manuscripts and scores. And my father said, but maestro, shouldn't we talk a little bit about this? And maestro says, well, you need a big chorus. Do you have enough people in the chorus? And he says, yes, I have 100. Well, the soprano is important. Ervanelli is, oh, good. You don't need me to tell you what to do. You've played it. You know it. You'll be great. In other words, you'll be great. Don't worry about it. So for my father, that afternoon was like a master class for him to have that exposure. But it also turned out that that concert that he did give of the Requiem in the New York Times got rave reviews. So somewhere we will credit all of the life experience together. But I'd like you to talk for a second about the last chapter, which is the Oberon overture, because that's a more scholarly chapter, and it's a bar-by-bar journey through Weber's Oberon overture, but you could explain it better than I.
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating chapter because in it, your father goes sort of blow by blow through this, what is it, an 8-minute long overture altogether of Weber for his opera Oberon. And he discusses various key points in the piece and how Toscanini approached them and rehearsed them, and what it was that he was after, and how he worked on balance, attack, phrasing, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a lesson for musicians in general and conductors in particular, I would say.
That chapter in the original book, on the end of it, it's the publisher and my mother, I presume, put in, "Here ends the manuscript," because that was the last thing he had written before he had died suddenly. And
He died of heart attack?
a coronary, yeah, right on 57th Street. He was meeting his manager for lunch at what was then the Great Northern Hotel at the end, down the street from Carnegie Hall. And and died on the scene. He was only 49. I was 12. So our little family was very upended. 3 became 2 overnight. It was a very strange, sad time. I mean, not only had, let's say, the music world lost someone of value, but hey, we had lost husband, father, hero, whatever. So he didn't get a chance to write what presumably would have been his last chapter. And we'll never know what he would have written. However, once again, at this library here of performing arts, and I would sit for hours with the boxes of material, I came across handwritten notes that of what he calls the final concert. Now, it was never published. He may never have gotten past, my mother hadn't even transcribed them into typing. I didn't find that. Because that last concert in April 1954 was a particularly notable event and rather sad, actually. And he had written about it. And if you could just tell the story of what actually happened, I will end it with the quote
Sure.
of that, because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
certainly memorable.
Yes, what happened, I mean, Toscanini clearly during his last 2 seasons was in decline, and also his vision in particular had become very bad. The last year, he really had lost his central vision, essentially. So, he was seeing everything in a fog, and he couldn't read scores, and he couldn't read books, and was very, very upset by that. Of course, he did have a photographic memory, but nevertheless, he was accustomed always to restudy from the text, and he couldn't do that in the last season. It was very, very frustrating for him, as I know from the conversation tapes that were recorded, as I said, unbeknownst to him, that his son made. But the last concert was an all Wagner concert, orchestral excerpts from Wagner's operas, overtures, and other pieces. And at the actual, the rehearsals were, some of them were okay and others were not okay. At the actual concert, which I believe was on a Sunday afternoon, Toscanini at one point sort of went blank and stopped conducting. And as one orchestra musician I know said, well, with most conductors, you wouldn't even notice. You just keep playing. But of course, the orchestra they were frightened for him, and they didn't know what was going to happen. And you can hear, the concert was recorded, you can hear the orchestra's at sea for a while. It's in the transition from it's in part of the Bacchanal from the Paris version of the Tannhäuser overture. And then they sort of come together, and he evidently starts conducting again, and they
Oh, you
end
can
it.
imagine that the guys in the control room were going crazy because they had
Yes.
to put a different piece
Well-
of music out to the home audience,
Well,
yes?
what happened, if they had just let it go, it would have been less shocking, because the problem lasted only less than a minute. What happened was that Guido Cantelli, a young conductor who was a kind of protege of Toscanini's, was in the control room, and he lost his head. He was afraid that Toscanini was having a stroke or something. And so he told them, put on a substitute recording. So they put on the Brahms First Symphony, which made no sense at all in the middle of this rather quiet place in the Wagner piece. And that went on for a few seconds. And then when Toscanini came,
Revived.
revived, they went back to the actual broadcast. So you can hear, there are two versions
Confusing.
recorded. You can hear the broadcast version as it went out, and you can also
Right.
hear what happened in the studio. So that was the last time he conducted in public.
It's very sad. I want to read now from my father's notes a portion of what he wrote, because he wrote the whole story out. But so I'm going to quote now. As our beloved 87-year-old maestro left the stage, dazed and tottering, he pushed past me and the baton dropped from his hand. It was to be the last of his conducting in public with the NBC Symphony. No more to hear the hoarse, frenzied vergogna, shame, balefully rending the air. No more to hear the menacing corpo del vostro Dio. I had played with Toscanini, the musician's supreme badge of honor. I knew that music performed with sacrificial white heat, passion, humility, and blinding honesty can be unforgettable. And they died within a year of each other, which is just interesting to me. My father was 49 and Toscanini was 89.
Right.
So there was a 40-year difference.
Yeah. It's so sad that his life ended at such a young age when he still had so much to give. But now, what about your decision to, in a way, complete the book and turn it into something slightly different and more profound?
I certainly think this whole experience, this whole journey has been so wonderfully emotional because I reconnected with my father from an adult perspective, not just from the adoring young daughter, 12-year-old daughter. And I really, truly can have and continue to appreciate his musicianship and the guy. He was a terrific guy. And I can look at some of the pictures. There's one of him coming off stage, dripping wet. It's my favorite picture. It shows his joy, who he was, his pride in his performance, because he was very open and very gregarious. And I reconnected with that person. And so I'm very proud to have been able to give this to him. And also my mother, who was very much a part of this story. And she was an artist and his partner on this book. And she made sure it was published. She had worked with Hupka, Robert Hupka, who did all of these wonderful portraits of Toscanini during mostly
Photos,
black and white photos during the recording sessions or the rehearsals, and they're scattered throughout this book, along with some of my own photographs from the family. But, and Robert Hupka was a recording engineer for RCA during that period of time, and Toscanini was his hero. So his photographs, my mother's attention to how to put this together, and now many years later, my putting all this together, again, working with Hupka's estate, Arthur Fierro, and it's a labor of love. It was a total labor of love for me. And I added my own pieces. I didn't write something for my dad. I don't mean for him. I wrote this all for him, but I didn't write something as though it should have been his last chapter. I just talk about what it was like. And the other thing that struck me through all of this, again with the research, was the soft spot I have for the maestro. Because for my whole life, he was a picture on a piano and a larger-than-life image of a famous, important person in our lives. So I could relate to him in a very personal way, and he's somebody I would have liked to have known. I don't know, it's a fantasy.
You and a lot of other women, by the way.
Just have a cup of coffee. But, and so what I see this book in the end, and I write about it in my coda, which is my last chapter, that this book is a tribute to two musicians whose paths fortuitously crossed and whose individual gifts inspired each of them in their lifelong quest to make beautiful music. And that makes me very proud. And I'm very
As it
pleased.
should.
Thank you. And I'm pleased. I was thinking about what my next project would be, and I think I want to take violin lessons. I do. I don't want to become a violinist. I don't want to play a recital. I just want to know what it feels like, because
That's
I've
great.
now lived for 3 years with all of this music. So I'm definitely going to do that. But I know what your next project is because it just came out, your new book.
I have a new book out,
And
10
it-
Masterpieces of Music, and I'm working on another one. They can't shut me up. you
Well,
know.
that's good for us all. And these books are available on Amazon, by the way, or in your local bookstore. We're going to end with another clip, and it's actually can be quite an emotional clip. So we're going to go back a little bit to what we were talking about, the politics. And in 1943, when the Mussolini's regime finally collapsed, Toscanini decided, I guess along with the State Department, to put together a concert celebrating the end of fascism, but also as a thank you to the Allies. And it's called the Hymn of the Nations, which is based on Verdi's work.
Right.
Tell us a
Well,
little
what
bit.
actually happened when Mussolini was deposed by his own fascist Grand Council at the end of July 1943, which was the first of the Axis powers to collapse, Toscanini conducted, I think, one movement of was Beethoven Fifth or the Eroica, I don't remember. I think it was the Fifth, and he said, that he would, when Germany then fell, he would do the whole symphony. He was asked by the Office of War Information, which was under the State Department, if he would contribute to a film about, Italian exiles who were living in freedom in the United. It was a propaganda film, obviously, but we were in World War II, so he and the orchestra contributed their services to making this half-hour film. He said he would not speak in the film. And it's interesting because he had been offered enormous sums of money to appear in a Hollywood movie, just conducting or whatever, and he had always said, no, I'm not an actor, I'm a musician. But when he was asked to do this for free, he said yes, because it was an important cause for him. And the idea was that this movie showing himself and people like Gaetano Salvemini, the historian, and Antonio Borghese, the author, and so on and so forth, various Italians of importance who were living in the United States in exile from the fascist regime, it was important to send this then back to Italy and to gradually other parts of Europe that were being liberated from the fascists and Nazis, to show them how in America people had continued to thrive and work and so on. And so he, in this film, you see him first conducting the overture to La Forza del Destino of Verdi. Then there's a sort of part in the middle where you see him at home with his grandson, Valfredo, who was 14 at the time. And then you see these other exiles. And then they sort of have a kind of, to our mind, a kind of kitschy reenactment of the day when Mussolini was deposed and the newsroom and, and all of that. And then he conducts Verdi's Hymn of the Nations, which was a potboiler that Verdi wrote in 1862 for an exposition in London to thank Britain and France for their contributions to the Italian reunification movement. And Toscanini edited the score, and he added at the end to the British and French and Italian anthems, he added the Socialist International, which had been the Russian national anthem, and it ends with the Star Spangled Banner for the other great allies at that time.
So this clip, enjoy it, everyone. You can see the whole movie on YouTube, but we've chosen something that is with John Pierce and the Westminster Choir. And there are even a couple of close-ups of my dad in there. You can go look for him. But it's very emotional, and little tears form every time I watch it because I'm feeling his passion and his release there. But so everyone enjoy. But I also want to thank Harvey for sharing this moment and talking about the maestro and this book. And
Well, thank you for bringing this book back to life. I mean, it's been out of print for a very long time, and everybody who's interested, I would say, not just in Toscanini, of course, but in orchestral playing and the whole art of musical performance should be interested in it.
well, thank you, and thank you again, and everybody enjoy all our books. Thank you.